Okay, so chapter 10, the muscular system. So, chapter 10, what I'm going to lecture on chapter 10 is actually going to be fairly small. A lot of chapter 10 is the anatomy. This is the muscle, this is where it is, this is where it attaches, this is what it does. And because of that, you've got the chapter 10 homework. So this isn't a very long chapter. Now realize the homework that you're doing is not on your exam. That's why it counts as part of your exam, because you're doing all of the work for it previous to taking your exam. But what is in this series of slides is definitely going to be there. Okay? All right. So let's talk gross anatomy. Chapter 9 is kind of the microanatomy and microphysiology, meaning that you've got this is a cell, this is how the cell works, this is how it functions. So if you are going from microanatomy to macro, macro means big. Macro is going to be, this is what the muscle looks like, this is what it does with all its parts and pieces. So pretty much this is all we're going through for this particular chapter. All right, so most skeletal muscle, not all, because this is science and there's never such a thing as all. Most skeletal muscle extends from one bone to another and comes across at least one joint. An example of an exception of that would be the facial muscles. The facial muscles are attached to the bone of your skull, but then they're attached to your skin, so you can actually make facial expressions. But when it comes to your other muscles, most of the time you've got a muscle. Yes, better. There's a muscle that is going to go from one bone to another bone, and then when it contracts, it pulls across this fulcrum or this joint that actually gives you the ability to move, okay? Muscle contraction causes most body movements by pulling one bone toward another bone across a mobile joint. So you've got this pulling of this bone closer to this bone by moving across this joint in your elbow, okay? So the action, the word action, when it comes to anatomy and physiology, is the movement that's accomplished by a muscle when it contracts. So if we were talking about the bicep causes flexion in your arm or at the elbow, okay? So that would be the action, all right? Now, the muscle itself, with its terminology, we've got basically three major parts to a muscle, and then we've got the things that attach that muscle to the bone. So we've got the origin, we've got the insertion, we've got the belly, and we've got the tendon. So the origin is going to be the fixed end or the head, usually both and they're the most stationary portion and usually the most proximal. So if we're talking about that bicep, okay, again, this would be the origin, because when I'm moving, this is the part that's moving. This part is stationary, right? So it's attached to, where am I? It's attached to the scapula, okay? So you've got that origin, the most fixed end, most stationary end. And again, think about directional terms. Proximal meant closest to the torso, distal meant furthest away. So when you're looking here, if this is the attachment point, this is the closest part to my torso. Now, the insertion is going to be the most mobile end, the one that actually moves around the most. And it's usually the most distal. So again, if we're talking about that bicep, this is the part of my arm that's moving, right? And if you go from this point to this point, this is the part that's furthest away from my torso, okay? So that's the insertion. The belly. So what's my belly? The middle part, right? So in the muscle, the belly is basically the part between the 2 points of attachment. So when you look here, I've got the origin, I've got the insertion, and here is the belly, okay? It's that region between them. And just like a belly, right? Just like a belly, it's going to kind of get bigger when you move it in the middle, okay? Yeah, I know, I don't have a muscle, just go with me on it. Now, tendons. We talked about this when we talked about the skeletal system. The tendons are going to be the things that actually attach the muscle to the bone. Something to keep in mind. Your muscle is not a connective tissue, meaning that it can't connect to anything. So you kind of have to have a go-between. The tendon is what allows me to attach to, at one end, the muscle, and at the other end, the bone, so that it's anchored down and can actually work as a pulley to get my arm to move the way that I want it to. So a tendon is responsible for attaching the muscle to bone. They can be very different in shape. You can have them looking like this, where you've got that kind of long cable-like dense structure, almost like the cord of a computer. You've got that kind of round, long cord. Anybody who's ever had chicken and you get to that part in the chicken leg that kind of is stringy and kind of spongy and, I don't know, rubbery, that is one of those tendons. Other tendons can actually look like a sheet, almost like you're taking a muscle and you're basically enfolding it into two sheets of tendon. That, in a fancy way of naming it, is called the aponeurosis, okay? Some are very, very short, practically non-existent. So you've got kind of, just like the variation in the way that the muscles are shaped, you've got the same kind of variation in the way that tendons are shaped. I'm going to pause you for a second while I move that light.